Hello everybody and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History for a special feature. And this is a very special feature because this time I'm going to be talking about the industry and telling you about one of fashion's most pioneering women in this incredible story of IM International and the birth of fashion forecasting. When we think of fashion's most pioneering and revolutionary women of the 20th century, the usual suspects tend to spring to mind, don't they? Coco Chanel, of course, Schiaparelli, the inimitable Diana Vreeland, and I'm sure there are those out there who would happily add Anna Wintour to this list. But you know what? There's somebody missing from this list, somebody who I personally believe belongs in this list as somebody who really did do something new and wonderful and creative and groundbreaking in 20th century fashion. This lady, her name is Leigh Rudd, and her story is incredible. This story is truly a fairy tale, but it doesn't begin in an enchanted kingdom. It begins on the streets of swinging London in the 1960s, and our heroine didn't want to grow up to marry a prince and go to the ball. She had much bigger dreams. Before I tell you the story of Leigh Rudd and IM International, I should probably explain to those of you who may not know what a fashion forecast or trend forecast is. Well, there had always been retail reports like the Tobey report. The Tobey report has been around since the 1920s, and what a retail report is this. American companies wanted information about what was selling in Europe. So retail reporters would visit the stores in Paris and London and report on what was in the stores so that American retailers could knock them off. Retail reporters now call themselves trend forecasters or fashion forecasters, and I'm sure you've heard of some of these companies like WGSN, Cool Hunting, Fashion Snoops, and they are all terrific at what they do, and what they do is really retail reporting. It's not exactly fashion forecasting. Let me tell you what they do. They look at the runway, they look at street style, they visit trendy stores, and mainly they look at graphs and charts to see what was selling well last year so they can tell their clients what will sell well this year. For example, a ripped graphic t-shirt with a retro image of Debbie Harry sold well last season, so try the same t-shirt with retro Madonna this season. It isn't forecasting. So they bring all of this information together and produce a report, and clients really want these reports. And you might be thinking, well, why can't they figure this out for themselves? Can't they go to stores? Can't they look at runway? Can't they do some street style spotting? Well, no, they don't have time. So they pay companies like WGSN and Fashion Snoops to do it for them. But in my opinion, this is not fashion forecasting. But you know what? Today, in 2018, that's okay, because fashion and culture as a whole doesn't want anything new at the moment. And I'll show you what I mean. This is a runway image from 2008. This is a runway image from 2018. Nothing has changed in a decade. I pulled this from a Zara catalog 2008, and here is Zara 2018. This is a street style image from 2008, and here's one from 2018. Spot the difference? I can't. You see? Designers, product developers, retailers, and fashion editors just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again in a cyclical manner, because there's nobody around to tell them what to do next. And culture doesn't want anything new at the moment, so all of this is okay. But to understand just how revolutionary the idea of fashion forecasting was in the 1970s, we really have to look at how fashion worked in the 1950s and how it then flipped in the 1960s. Okay, in the 50s, fashion came from Paris. It truly did. A designer would come up with a collection which he would show in his salon. Guests of his salon would include American fashion editors, British fashion editors, who would then feature these collections in their magazines. These collections would then be ripped off at real-life retail level and then end up on the streets, worn by regular women. This idea sort of flipped in the 60s. Ideas started coming up from the streets in London. This was the youthquake. This was the era of swinging London. Then, independent designers such as Mary Quant would look at street style, and their collections would be inspired by what they saw on the street. By the way, Mary Quant always maintained that she never invented the miniskirt. She said she just noticed how the girls on Carnaby Street and the King's Road were hemming their skirts shorter and shorter. So she started designing her clothes with shorter hemlines, which she would then sell in her boutique. The Paris designers would then see what was going on in these trendy boutiques in London and develop and create couture versions of these looks. Fashion editors from America would go to these collections, feature them in magazines like Vogue. They would be ripped off at real-life retail and end up on the street. So you can see there was a little bit of a flip here, and although it started on the street and ended on the street, it was a very different street by the time it reached the USA. The problem facing American fashion in the 1960s was that London was the center of fashion, and by the time retail reporters got their reports to their American clients, things had changed in swinging London. So America really was quite behind Europe in the 1960s. Let me show you some examples. This is a wonderful image from a Sears catalog, 1969, directed obviously at young women. Take a look at what young women were wearing in London in 1969. It's like they come from two different decades, let alone the same year. Let me give you another example. Look at this wonderful cover from 17 magazine, March 1969. Take a look at her. She looks great, but she is still really working in that early 60s Jackie Kennedy or very early mod, beginning of Carnaby Street look that Britain had moved away from. Let me show you a cover from Jackie magazine, a teenage mag in Britain from 1969, and look what this girl is wearing. This really is the Edwardian / Deco revival starting. Utterly different. So you can sort of see that in the 1960s, fashion's flight from London to New York was somewhat delayed. And this delay could not possibly happen in the 70s. The 70s was the decade of escape into trends. In the 1960s, fashion was used as a means of celebration. In the 70s, as I just mentioned, it was used as a means of escape. What were we escaping from? Well, everything. Watergate, the end of the Vietnam War, the rise of terrorism, the oil crisis, the economic crisis, the rise of the serial killer. We were escaping from everything in the 70s, and fashion was used as a means of escape, which is why fashion changed so much in the decade. Remember earlier on when we looked at the fashion images from 2008 and how nothing had really changed since then? Well, take a look at this image from circa 1970 and this one from about 1980. Look how different they are. Look how much fashion changed. What made fashion change so much? Well, I'll tell you, about 52 zillion trends. Here are just some of them. The Victorian Edwardian storybook trend, glam rock, the Deco revival, the gypsy peasant romantic trend, the liberated pantsuit, disco, effortless elegance, all-American sportif, ethnic, punk rock, and then towards the end of the decade, new wave. And of course, throughout all of this, there were fashion fads like hot pants, mi party, the Annie Hall look. If you're confused, don't worry. Here on the Ultimate Fashion History, we have a two-part lecture series on fashion of the 70s. We throw a spotlight on some of these 70s trends, like the Deco Revival. We have quite a few 20th century style icons in that series, and 70s movies do feature in our Fave Film Fashion series. But this was a complicated decade, and the industry needed help. Designers needed help. What am I supposed to do next? Retailers needed help. What am I supposed to buy next? Well, thank goodness somebody came along to help them. Enter Leigh Rudd. Now, who is this Leigh Rudd that I'm constantly talking about in this episode? Leigh Rudd was a young woman in the mid-1960s, in her early 20s, part English, part American, and part Cherokee, I believe. And after graduating from college, she went to work and live in Paris. And she worked for André Courrèges, who you may remember me talking about an awful lot in our episode on fashion and outer space. Leigh Rudd had a very unique way of looking at the world, a very unique way of thinking. It's too easy to say that she thought outside the box, because of course she did, but she had a very unique way of joining all of the dots in culture, in politics, in the zeitgeist, and predicting what might happen next. It's a very unique way of looking at the world. Now, Monsieur Courrèges was not the only person interested in the incredible mind of Leigh Rudd. When she was in college, she was actually headhunted by the CIA. They saw something quite unique in the way she saw the world and connected these dots, and they actually wanted her to join them. Leigh had other ideas, and instead of becoming a spy for the CIA, she went on to become one of the pioneering women of 20th century fashion, but more of that in a second. Leigh had to be where the action was, and so in the mid-1960s, she moved to swinging London, because of course, that was the center of everything. It's where the trendy people were. It's where the cool shops were. And Leigh really lived the life of a swinging bird in 60s London. She was hanging out with the pop groups. She was going to the galleries. She was going to the nightclubs. And she was also doing her own retail report, along with designing and writing and commentary. She started doing retail reports. They were quite traditional in the beginning, but of course they weren't, because it wasn't enough for Leigh to say, oh, Paisley is in. She would have to explain why Paisley was in, where it came from historically, where it was going. But as the 60s drew to an end, Leigh realized that the 70s were going to be very different. Almost like a fortune teller, she saw that troubled waters were ahead, and that fashion would respond by moving very quickly and giving people an awful lot of means of escape. So she had a really revolutionary idea. It wasn't enough for people to know what was happening now, what's in the stores now, what designers are doing now. No. Suddenly she had the idea that she should tell them what's going to happen next. Nobody she spoke to about her idea understood it. How can you possibly predict the future of fashion if it hasn't happened yet? Nobody got it. And then in 1968, she finally met somebody who understood. This man, David Wolfe. Just as with Leigh Rudd, David Wolfe's name is legend within the industry, but not that well known beyond the industry. And as with Leigh Rudd, I think it should be. Who was David Wolfe? Well, he was a young American working in London in the 1960s, because he had to be where the action was as well, and working as a very, very successful fashion illustrator. He was the in-house fashion illustrator for Fortnum and Mason. He was the illustrator for British Vogue. He had a very successful and very lucrative career. He didn't really want to change it, and then he met Leigh Rudd, and he thought her idea was so revolutionary and so exciting. This idea of creating fashion before it even happened. He brought his own unique set of talents. He could draw. Leigh and David could discuss fashion that hadn't been invented yet, that didn't exist, and he could draw it. Well, now that she had an ally, Leigh Rudd formed a company that would become legendary. IM International. The IM stood for Imaginative Minds, and IM International truly was the world's first fashion forecasting company. In fact, Leigh was the first person ever to use the term forecast in regards to fashion and not weather. And there they are, a young Leigh Rudd and David Wolfe, and here they are with their team. Leigh had a talent of attracting the most creative, interesting, and interested people. Very, very quickly, IM went from a spark of an idea in Leigh Rudd's mind to an international multi-million-dollar company. And when I say quickly, I mean within 2 or 3 years. They had offices in London, in New York, in LA, and then in Tokyo. They were represented in, I think, about 32 countries. They were really one of the first genuinely global fashion companies within the industry. It's such an incredible story. The reason IM International became so successful so quickly is because Leigh Rudd realized something that nobody else did, that fashion is part of the circuit board of culture, everything sparking electricity of something else. Politics, economics, science, art, literature, music, all of it sparking off each other, and then sparking fashion. I always say fashion is not an island, it's a response, right? Well, Leigh Rudd and David Wolfe understood this instinctively at a time when very few other industry people really did. And instead of looking to fashion magazines or designers for their lead, Leigh and David would go to museums. They'd hang out at the hippest nightclubs. They'd go to the movies. They would read all the books on the bestseller list. See, putting all the dots together. They'd listen to music, go to concerts. Of course, read the Financial Times, read the news every day. Keep up with what was happening in science and medicine and food. And then when everything came together, they'd be able to say, okay, this is what's going to happen next. And how did they deliver this information to their hungry and ever-growing client base? The legendary IM Report. The IM Report was fashion's Bible in the 1970s. It was 100 pages long, and it was the first report of its kind that was actually tactile, with swatches and yarns, and of course sketches, because the IM Report discussed things that didn't exist yet, but fortunately David Wolfe could draw them. And so, armed with everything that they had taken from the zeitgeist, they would sit down together, and Leigh would say, well, I'm seeing this, and I'm feeling that, and I'm thinking this, and I'm sensing that, and I'm feeling the 50s might be back. And then David would say, okay, well, are you seeing drain pipes? Are we seeing leather jackets? What's going to happen? And he would be able to draw Leigh's vision. But it wasn't enough just to produce the IM Report. Leigh and David had to live their trends. Great example, the Deco revival of the late 1960s. Leigh realized instinctively that it was going to give way to an old Hollywood 1930s, 1940s glamour. As times got harder in the 70s, people would want to escape into glamorous times. And so before this trend ever happened, Leigh and David wore it and lived it. There's a picture of David Wolfe looking very Casablanca, and here's Leigh Rudd the epitome of a 1930s movie star, so Leigh and David would wear their trends. They'd wear them to the Rainbow Room. They'd wear them as they strolled down the King's Road to visit their celebrity friends, and then their friends and celebrities started picking up on these trends. Leigh Rudd really was a celebrity in her own right. She once famously had a dinner party, and the guests included Zandra Rhodes, the famous British designer you see here, Vanessa Redgrave. Vanessa and Zandra had just teamed up to open a fashion boutique in Fulham, the Fulham Clothes Shop. Who else was at this dinner party? Christine Keeler, the notorious party girl from the Profumo affair. Leigh brought people together, interesting people, diverse people, because she wanted to hear their ideas. She wanted to see how they were feeling, and of course everyone flocked to her because they wanted to know what was going to happen next. And one of the big things that happened next in the 70s was the rise of Milan as a fashion capital, and of course IM International were there. Leigh and David were particularly interested in the burgeoning young designers coming out of Milan. They met one who they found particularly impressive, but he was so junior he couldn't even get into the shows. So Leigh and David sneaked him in to the Milan fashion shows at the beginning of his career, and he was forever grateful. Who was this young man? Of course, Gianni Versace. And there's Gianni and there's David Wolff on the right. Another young designer from Milan they championed was Armani. Speaking of Versace, I recently saw the wonderful FX miniseries, The Assassination of Gianni Versace. If you haven't seen it, please do. And at the end of this video, I'm going to tell you about another new miniseries based in the fashion industry that, fingers crossed, is about to come out, so stay tuned for that. Of course, IM International covered the Paris collections every season, but by the time we get to the mid to late 70s, IM International was so powerful that the Paris Syndicat did not want anyone from IM to attend the shows, and yet they did. They had front row seats at Yves Saint Laurent's iconic rich Russian peasant collection. How did they get those seats if the Syndicat forbade them from even attending the collection? Well, here's how. Talk about a great caper. Leigh got all of the IM staff to dress up as cleaning ladies, made David Wolff dress up as a workman. They all arrived in their disguises 2 hours before the show began. They were allowed to just walk in. Hey, they were just the cleaning staff, the workmen. They went into the main salon. They took everybody's name card off their chairs in the front row and replaced them with their own. Hid in the toilets until showtime, and voila. I love that story. It's so typical of some of these capers and jinx that IM got up to in the 70s, and that story always reminds me of Audrey Hepburn in To Catch a Thief. Because of Versailles 73, Leigh understood instinctively again that New York was going to be another fashion capital, and so IM International opened a second office in New York. They would then open one in LA and later Tokyo. In New York, their clients included Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren. But when I say clients, it's not in the sense that people talk about their clients today, where a retail report might get sent off to the corporate office of some multi-million-dollar international conglomerate and end up on the desk of an intern. No, David Wolff would sit down with Calvin Klein. They'd have lunch together, and Calvin would say, "Oh, I really want my models to look hot this season." And David Wolff would say, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And Calvin would give him his ideas, and David would sketch things out for him and recommend movies, and they would bounce ideas back and forth. Leigh would sit down with Ralph Lauren, talk to him about color, talk to him about concepts, talk to him about visions. So this was a very, very different world, a world of real hands-on creativity and communication. And of course, because they had to live their trends, while in New York, Leigh Rudd absolutely embraced the whole 70s New York scene. She was always at Studio 54. She was hanging out with Warhol, with Marissa Berenson, with all of these people. Here is a wonderful photograph of Leigh Rudd roller skating on her way to Studio 54. But as I said earlier, Leigh and then David actually did become sort of hot celebrities in their own rights. Here's a picture of David modeling for, it looks like Kenzo. And here he is modeling, I know, for his pal Armani. IM International were always in the fashion press, in the industry press, on television, interviewed. Everybody wanted to know what was going to happen next. And then what happened? Well, the world changed and fashion changed with it, as it always does. Instead of being about creativity, as the multi-billion-dollar international fashion conglomerations and syndicates took over, creativity sort of went out of the window in favor for a play-it-safe repetition of past ideas. And that's all good and well. There's enough going on in the world right now without having to worry about what we should wear, right? The world is a very risky place at the moment, and people don't want to take fashion risks. They're not interested in what's happening next. They want to know what sold last season. And so-called fashion forecasting went back to being retail reporting. And yet, everybody knows that IM International was incredibly important, groundbreaking, and that Leigh Rudd was a true pioneer, which is why IM International is mentioned in nearly every fashion forecasting textbook. Here are just some of them. So, what happened to those two fashion mavericks? Well, after more than 50 years working in fashion, David Wolff finally retired. He lives in California, where he runs in his retirement Paper Dollywood. Interestingly, he went back to his first profession, illustration, and he runs a little company of paper dolls. He does beautiful paper doll artwork and paper doll books of movie stars and Hollywood fashion. I'll put links to everything below. But what about Leigh Rudd? Leigh Rudd is not retired. She is still forecasting and consulting and writing and designing and creating, and looks absolutely fabulous, doesn't she? She recently brought out a coloring book, Fashion Trends, London Look of the 60s. I think there's quite a few people on UFH who might enjoy that. She has a fabulous website. I'll put the link below. On her website, she has a very interesting project, The People's Fashion, a documentary about the 1960s by Leigh Rudd, where every week she talks about her experiences in London in the 1960s, really being at the heart of this revolutionary cultural moment. But the thing that I'm most excited about, that you can read about on her website, is Fashion Sharks. Leigh has written a television series based on actual events about her career, her life, and the incredible world of 70s fashion. Who would you like to play Leigh Rudd? I have a few ideas. I really hope that this gets picked up by HBO or Netflix or FX or something like that, because the world is hungry for good television, and I'm hungry for television about fashion. Well, I hope you enjoyed going inside the fashion industry in this week's episode on the Ultimate Fashion History. You can contact me through my website, amandahalley.com. Join our Facebook group. We always have loads of fun over there. Check out our publishing company, Dean Street Press. I'll put links to everything below. I'll be back very soon with a new episode on the Ultimate Fashion History, so just click the little circle to subscribe. And until then, make like Leigh Rudd and dream big. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.